The third floor HVAC blew again. Same circuit, same fuse box, same late afternoon hum of tired lights and older carpet curling at the corners. I grabbed the panel key off my ring and crouched in the hallway outside Conference B knees, reminding me they weren't 35 anymore. No one thanked me. No one noticed. My name's Walter Harlan. I've been with Eastmark Dynamics for 22 years, most of them spent crawling through ductwork, fixing the things nobody else saw until they broke. Officially, facilities operations. Unofficially, the guy they called when something stopped working, or someone needed cleaning up quietly. You can feel it when it happens, when people stop saying good morning, when their eyes flick to your badge a little too long, like they're checking for an expiration date. You start noticing things you're not supposed to. Whispered hallway check-ins, calendar invites that end, with ellipses. That afternoon, I was replacing a blown surge protector outside the IT bullpen when I saw the email hit my screen. Subject line, quick sync. Today, 3:45 p.m. From Haley Trevors and Colin Reeves, our new HR director and the new CEO. I didn't open it right away. I didn't need to. Haley had started 2 months earlier. Colin barely won. Together they'd been parading through the halls like they were saving us from ourselves. Never mind that Eastmark had grown off the backs of people like me, people who built the foundation while they were still learning buzzwords. I tightened the last screw, wiped the dust off my hands, and glanced at the building's main access panel, the one only 3 of us ever touched. It still had my initials inside from a late-night refit back in '09. The ink had faded, but it was there. So was the original power bypass relay. I'd installed it with Dan Mercer back when the company was expanding too fast for our infrastructure. Dan retired last year, quietly, no party, no email. I remember staying until 1 a.m. with a roller and a case of off-white eggshell from Home Depot when they couldn't get painters in time for the client tour. That same client now owned the building, the same building I kept running even when budget cuts left me patching wires with my own toolkit. They stopped replacing light bulbs on the 3rd floor 6 months ago. I brought mine from home. Now HR wanted a quick sync. I took the long hallway back to the elevator, past the trophy wall they stopped updating in 2017, past the empty break room where the fridge still had masking tape on the handle that read, "Do not open." Smell. That tape. My handwriting. I passed the executive floor now freshly carpeted and full of standing desks and paused at the door to the server closet. Still locked, still humming. I paused, just long enough to hear it. Then I rode the elevator to the ground floor and watched the LED flicker slightly when it stopped. Another thing they'd ignore until it broke for real. Back at my desk, really just a converted storage room between janitorial and security, I opened the calendar invite. "Hi, Walter. Please stop by HR Conference A today at 3:45 p.m. for a brief sync. No need to prepare anything, just a quick check-in with Colin and me to touch base on future alignment. Appreciate all you've done." Haley, future alignment? That's how they say we're done with you now. I sat there for a full minute just listening. The old pipes behind my chair groaned with the AC running high again. It was 84 outside. They'd call me by 5, asking why it felt warm in the call center. The key ring on my belt clinked as I leaned back. I'd had that brass ring since 2001. Same one they gave me the day I got promoted from contractor to full-time. That key had opened every floor in this building, every office they'd ever sat in. I looked at the Outlook invite again. It was polite, efficient, like scheduling a dental cleaning, or a firing. They didn't even pretend it was about anything else. I checked the building schedule. Haley had no other meetings after 4. Colin was booked until 6 with a gap at 3:30. Plenty of time to shake a hand nod once and walk me out quietly. I shut the laptop. They think they're about to take everything from me, but they forgot who signed the lease. Before I dive deeper, comment where you're listening from. Ever worked somewhere long enough to know the building better than the people running it? Like and subscribe if you've lived through that kind of loyalty. The elevator stopped on floor 4 with that slight mechanical lurch that always made the panel lights flicker, something no one ever budgeted to fix. My badge still worked. I tapped it and walked into the HR wing like it was just another maintenance call. Haley Trevors was waiting outside the conference room tablet in hand posture stiff like she'd practiced. She gave me that polished little smile I'd seen her use in town halls, the one that said, "We're all on the same team," right before she cut it in half. "Walter, thanks for coming up." Her voice had the clipped warmth of a voicemail she wouldn't check twice. Inside, the lights were too bright. The chairs were new faux leather that still gave off chemical fumes when they heated up. Colin Reeves sat at the head of the table. Young, polished one of those MBA imports who looked like he'd been designed by a branding firm. "Walter," he said with a nod. "Appreciate you making the time." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at the table. 3 bottles of water, all unopened. A paper printout with my name facing me. And a small navy folder Eastmark logo printed faintly in silver. I sat down and placed my keyring on the table, the brass catching the fluorescent light. We wanted to have a quick conversation about direction. Haley began sliding the folder toward me, like it might bite her if she pushed too hard. "You've been with the company a long time, and that's not lost on us." She paused just long enough to make sure I'd heard the compliment, then kept going. "With our upcoming restructuring and digital integration plan, we're streamlining legacy operations. That includes consolidating some roles that have become less central to the future model." I opened the folder. 2 pages, severance agreement, 4 weeks of pay, NDA clause highlighted. They weren't even offering Cobra help, just the standard packet, like I'd walked in off the street last summer. Colin leaned forward slightly. "This is by no means a reflection on you, Walter. You've been instrumental in keeping this place running." I looked up. He didn't flinch. I respected that. "It's just that the building lease is now handled externally. Facilities contracts are managed through our real estate partners, so I'm not your problem anymore," I said. Calm, flat. Haley opened her mouth, closed it, then tried a different tack. "We wanted to give you space to think it over. No pressure to sign today." I looked at the pen sitting beside the folder, Eastmark branded, same style they gave out at the executive offsite 3 years ago. I'd fixed the PA system at that event, while wearing a stained polo shirt they made me change in the van. I didn't touch the pen. There's a moment, just a few seconds, where your brain tries to decide whether something is humiliating or just sad. This was both. "You'll still have access through Friday," Haley added. "After that, our systems partner will deactivate credentials." I nodded slowly as if I were just understanding the full picture. But I'd known it when I got the invite. They weren't firing me. They were erasing me. "We really appreciate your service," Colin added, standing slightly like that would make it official. "Do you?" I asked. He blinked. I picked up the folder, tapped it gently against the edge of the table, and stood. The keyring jingled in my hand as I slipped it back onto my belt. I thought about the sticker still stuck to the back of the main HVAC relay, the one with my initials. I thought about the 6th floor breaker box I'd rewired myself when the data team lost power before that board meeting. And I thought about the building lease, the one no one had checked in 3 years. "Thank you both," I said. This was enlightening. Haley exhaled. Colin gave a small nod, like we'd all agreed on something civil. And I walked out without another word. Back in the elevator, I watched the numbers light up in reverse. 4, 3, 2. That folder in my hand felt weightless, like a receipt for something you never bought. I got to the ground floor and paused. Then I walked past the front desk, past the reception lobby, and into the west stairwell. No one used that wing anymore since the expansion, but it's still connected to the auxiliary server room, the one they'd left on the original power grid. I stood there hand resting on the metal push-bar door and let myself remember. When my daughter turned 13, I missed her recital because the security system had gone down after hours. I stayed overnight so the building would pass inspection by morning. I kept the place alive through 2 recessions, 3 CIOs, and a failed acquisition. Now I was 4 pages in a severance packet. But here's the thing they forgot. I never gave up my tenant access. Because 5 years ago, when Eastmark tried to cut costs during the merge, I signed a sublease through a shell company. On paper, I was just an anonymous tenant with full rights to the West Wing, and in the building's master system. That lease still supersedes their IT offboarding plan. They thought they were giving me 4 weeks' pay, but I'm still on the lease. They fired the wrong man, and next Tuesday they'll find out what that actually means. The door beeped green before I even touched the handle. Guess they hadn't gotten around to revoking my access badge yet, or maybe they just forgot who still held the lease. The Monday after my termination, I waited until after 7 p.m. when the last car usually left the Eastmark lot, then pulled around the side of the building and parked in visitor overflow. Same dented streetlight, same gravel patch that always flooded when it rained. 22 years of habits don't vanish just because some young exec signs a folder. The security guard Manny wasn't at his usual desk, probably on rounds. I wasn't here to talk anyway. It's strange walking through a building that still smells like your life, like your years are trapped in the carpet. The overhead fluorescence buzzed a little flickering near conference room 2B, where I once convinced a vendor to extend payment terms by 90 days during the 2010 crunch. The black scuff marks from the rolling whiteboard were still there on the tile. I didn't linger. The server room was locked secure badge only. But back in 2018, I'd paid for the new access control panel myself when the company froze capital expenses. And I knew the override pattern better than my daughter's Netflix password. Tap, hold, tap, twice. Click. The door swung open with a soft hiss of cold air and humming drives. They'd moved the physical drives around, labeled things differently. But Protocol D3 was still running in the background just like I'd designed. Most folks at Eastmark didn't even know what it was, just a line item under facilities. A redundant data cache server tied not to production, but to building system security, HVAC logs, energy reporting. Nobody touched it because nobody understood it. But D3 also stored the building lease in full, my sublease agreement with the property management firm, and all the payment trails that came from a shell company I registered 15 years ago, Harlan Site Services. They thought the company leased the building, but the truth was, Eastmark leased it from me. They just never bothered to read the fine print I'd embedded into the original documentation during an expansion phase buried under project billing. I'd never intended to weaponize it. It was just cleaner at the time, more efficient for the legal merger we were prepping. But when Colin Reeves handed me that folder with the smirk of a man who thought he understood power, the math changed. The folder's still on my kitchen counter. I haven't opened it. A red indicator blinked on the rack. Someone had tried to reassign access privileges this morning, probably IT removing my admin credentials. But the thing about D3, it was siloed, unlinked. No script could touch it unless you were physically in the room. I keyed in a command string. The screen flickered to green status owner. Access active. It felt like shaking hands with a ghost, my own fingerprint preserved in digital ink. I didn't make any changes, not yet. But I printed one document, a copy of the original lease with the Eastmark executive sign-off still visible at the bottom. Colin's uncle had signed it back in 2011. Funny how family ties go deeper than spreadsheets. I folded the document and slid it into my coat pocket. On the way out, I passed my old office. The nameplate was gone, but the outline from the adhesive still clung to the frosted glass. Inside, the lights were off, but my old desk was still there, stripped clean but familiar. They hadn't brought in a replacement yet. On the far wall behind the coat hook, I noticed something. A faint scratch about 6 inches long, right where the metal edge of my chair used to clip the drywall. I used to joke that I was slowly sawing the wall in half with meetings. I reached out and ran my fingers across it. There's a moment when silence becomes heavier than noise. Not grief, not anger, just gravity. I wasn't going to vandalize anything. I wasn't going to make threats. But I was going to make it extremely uncomfortable for them to forget who built this place. As I reached the stairwell, I spotted a folded note on the landing. Handwritten, not typed. My name, Walter, scrawled on the front in sharp blue ink. Inside, thought you'd come back. Don't wait too long, Manny. No date, no explanation. But it made me smile. They thought they'd scrub me out of the system. But the system doesn't forget its architect, especially not when he still has the keys. And in 3 days, when the new quarterly lease payment triggers someone, Legal's going to get a very uncomfortable reminder of just how little Colin understood. Let's just say, the eviction notice was already printed. They just hadn't realized who it was for yet. The light in Mrs. Monroe's office always had this strange tint to it, half sterile, half amber, like it couldn't decide if it belonged in a clinic or an old library. I sat across from her watching the way the sun hit her nameplate. She adjusted her glasses, slid the manila envelope forward, and said, "All we need is your signature, Mr. Harlan. Then we'll proceed per clause 12C. I didn't reach for the pen right away. It's a surreal thing staring down the contract you wrote when you never thought you'd need it. Not like this. When Eastmark Dynamics first moved into the building back in 2001, Colin Reeves had barely passed his Series 63. I was the one who handled the lease negotiations, while the executive team juggled IPO prep. We signed a 25-year master lease, my name, my credentials, my legal review. Back then, it was just another stack of paper with a few emergency fallback clauses no one ever thought we'd use. But Clause 12C was mine, my idea. It gave the master leaseholder me full right to accelerate termination for cause if any subtenants like Eastmark violated terms of occupancy or engaged in misconduct affecting building operations. Haley's HR letter had included those words operational misconduct. They didn't realize the phrasing they had used to get rid of me was the exact phrase that enabled me to start getting rid of them. "You don't have to go through with it," Evelyn said gently, voice barely above the hum of her desk fan. I looked at her, then really looked her blouse buttoned high, gray hair pulled into a perfect twist kindness that didn't flinch. She wasn't trying to stop me. She just needed to give me one last off-ramp. I smiled, faint tired. If I don't pull this thread now, they'll keep strangling people with it. She nodded once and handed me the pen. Signing my name was easier than I thought it would be. No shaking, no sweat. Just pressure on the page and a 30-day countdown no one else knew had started. The letter wouldn't go out yet, not until the compliance review finished. That was the trigger. This was just loading the chamber. "You'll get the certified audit report before the 14th, Evelyn said, checking the timeline again. "If everything's substantiated, we serve them on the 15th. No appeals." I leaned back in the chair, silent for a moment. "Do you remember the old parking spaces? The ones with names painted instead of numbers?" She smiled, surprised. "Yours was the last one we removed. Took forever to scrape off. I saw it last week. You can still see the shadow of my name in the concrete. That's what Eastmark never understood. I wasn't a tenant. I was the foundation." Back at home that night, I pulled out a small blue folder from the bottom of my filing cabinet. It was labeled Initial Lease Drafts, 2001, and inside was my original markup notes in red ink sticky tabs, still faintly sticky, a coffee stain on the corner from when Dan Mercer had dropped his mug during a fire drill. I traced the corner of one page. Clause 12C was circled twice underlined and flagged with one word in all caps, optional. I had kept it in anyway. Sometimes the protection you think is optional turns out to be the only thing that saves you. Dan called me 2 days later. "Walter, you didn't hear this from me, but Colin's been bragging that Bloom Pulse is ready to take over our floor. Says the paperwork's already in motion." I held the phone to my ear and stared at the eviction draft on my screen. "Good to know," I said quietly. "Means the timing will sting." I could almost hear Dan grinning. "You always did play chess while the rest of us played darts." But I wasn't smiling, because here's the thing. I hadn't set out to destroy anyone. I just wanted to be left in peace. But sometimes silence gets mistaken for weakness. Sometimes people forget that quiet men still hold keys. One of those keys was sitting on my desk, a little silver one, unremarkable at first glance. But it still unlocked the rooftop access to the old HVAC system that powered Eastmark's West Wing. I hadn't touched it in a decade. I picked it up and turned it over slowly in my hand. Everything was lining up. The audit trail, the sublease compliance clause, the quiet approval from Evelyn, the lease language they never even read. They fired me in one sentence. They just forgot I wrote the paragraph that came after it. I placed the silver key back in the drawer, closed the lease folder, and stared out the window as the sun dipped behind the skyline. 30 days. Tick. They thought I was bluffing until the building manager walked in with a clipboard and a deadline. And when they realized who'd signed it, it was already too late. The sound of Mrs. Monroe's heels on the lobby tile was barely audible beneath the hum of the building's aging HVAC. But I heard them anyway. I always had a thing for patterns, how certain sounds carry deeper meaning in certain spaces. On this particular Thursday morning, it meant she had something in her hand. She was clutching a blue folder when I turned the corner. "Morning, Mr. Harlan," she said, not quite meeting my eye. I nodded. "Let me guess. Lease file." She hesitated. "Tenant audit notice. They're out of compliance." She didn't need to say who. I already knew. 3 weeks had passed since Haley Trevors handed me that one-page termination letter and escorted me off the floor like I was a risk to security. They boxed up my desk like it was an HR crime scene. But no one had checked the basement file storage on level P3. That's where the original lease documents were. And I was the one who'd signed them. Back in 2001, Eastmark Dynamics had entered a long-term facility lease on this building under the founder, Warren Linwood. He was old school, believed in handshake deals and over-documenting everything, which is why, when we renewed the master lease in 2010, the updated Clause 14B remained in place. In the event of an executive retirement structural transition, or involuntary release of a primary lessee's signatory lease control and successor rights default to the co-signatory of longest standing. That co-signatories, me, they never updated it when the new regime took over. I had quietly remained a primary lease delegate under that clause for the past 13 years. Mrs. Monroe opened the blue folder, slowly, her voice neutral. As of this week, Eastmark's internal filings show no authorized successor documentation. That triggers provisional review and audit. Your name is still listed as the fallback contact. I kept my voice calm. And the building's policy. Automatic tenancy review. We can initiate a lease freeze during the review period. She paused. Including halting pending occupancy transfers. The timing couldn't have been worse for them. They'd just signed an agreement to sublet 2 floors to Bloom Pulse Inc., a flashy biotech startup with aggressive growth plans. New signage was already being mocked up for the front lobby. A fresh coat of paint was halfway up the east stairwell, but none of that meant anything without lease continuity clearance. I glanced at the signature line she was reviewing. It was mine, in blue ink, a stubby rollerball pen from an old conference in Minneapolis. I remembered the way Warren had watched me sign it, back then quiet approval in his eyes, like he trusted I'd always know what mattered more than what was urgent. That same pen had jammed in my drawer for years. But the signature, it held. So they can't move forward with Bloom Pulse yet, I said. She nodded, not without clearing the delegation issue, and given the clause, you still retain review rights. Dan Mercer found me that afternoon. He'd been with facilities almost as long as I had. Loyal, underpaid, kept the servers cool and the plumbing warm, and never complained when we needed Sunday access for client tours. You really still have your name on the lease? He asked, barely whispering. Is that even legal? I handed him a copy of the lease excerpt, with the clause highlighted. It's not just legal, it's enforceable. He stared at it, then let out a low whistle. No wonder Haley's been stomping around like a kicked wasp. That was putting it mildly. I'd heard she'd personally walked Bloom Pulse's CEO through the space just 2 days ago. Full tour signed, pre-move schedule, vendor coordination, even a catered planning lunch. All of it dependent on something she never thought to check. The worst kind of power is the kind people forget you still hold. And I held it, not out of ego, not out of spite, but because for 22 years I kept the building running, the clients happy, the leases up to date, and the records clean. They replaced me with a system they barely understood, but no software warns you when the fine print is human. I walked out to the mailbox that night, sealed envelope in hand. Official notification, intent to review lease succession, signature required. It wasn't a threat, it was a courtesy. They had 72 hours. By morning, the new tenant signage project was on hold. 2 electricians were reassigned. And for the first time in weeks, Eastmark's executive team had a problem they couldn't solve with a Slack message or an emergency all hands. They had to talk to me. To the man they fired with a generic template and a hollow handshake. I looked at Mrs. Monroe as she scanned the building logs for document delivery status. How long you think they'll wait? She didn't smile, but her eyes had that flicker of dry amusement. Not long, Mr. Harlan. You're the last person they want to call, and the only one they need. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a clause no one bothered to erase. That night, I slid the old lease folder back into my drawer, not for safekeeping, just for the satisfaction of hearing it thud into place. Because this wasn't over yet, not even close. The email came through at 8:47 a.m. on a Thursday. Subject line, clause 14B, interpretation, clarification request. I didn't even open it right away. Just sat there with my coffee watching the steam curl above the rim of my chipped cup, the one Dan had given me 5 Christmases ago, with the company logo already half faded. I'd known this was coming. The moment Evelyn Monroe slid the stamped lease packet back into her leather folio 2 days earlier, I knew Colin would hit the panic button. What I didn't expect was how fast they'd scramble behind the scenes. Colin hadn't emailed me directly, of course. That would have felt too much like an admission. Instead, it came from one of the in-house lawyers, someone I'd never met, whose name probably wasn't even on payroll 3 months ago. The body of the message was polite, legalese. They were reviewing recent historical lease amendments and seeking clarification around subclause enforcement during transitional occupancy events. In other words, please tell us you're bluffing. I replied with a screenshot. Just 1 page, 1 paragraph, 1 line highlighted in pale yellow. In the event of non-renewal without 60-day certified notice, the occupying entity forfeits operational access upon notice of successor's lease execution. No further commentary, no signature quote, just a follow-up. Executed and filed October 3, 2007, page 17, Let me know if you need the wet signature copy. Walter. Then I stood up, slid the old blue lease binder into my canvas messenger bag, and headed to Evelyn's office. She didn't ask why I was there, just waved me in and turned down the volume on her desk radio, jazz spilling softly out of the speakers. Any movement yet, she asked. I nodded. Legal's getting noisy. She gave a little smirk. Let me guess Colin's panicking but hiding behind counsel. I didn't respond, but I pulled the copy of the tenant transition checklist from my bag and placed it gently on her desk. I'd seen it a dozen times during my years helping with vendor compliance and security audits. Only this time, the red stamp at the top said Final Lease Changeover, Bloom Pulse Inc. Evelyn's eyes scanned it. Then she looked up. They've got until noon Friday, Walter. That's when the new access protocols take effect. I nodded, I know. And I did. I knew because I helped write the damn systems protocols back in 2011. I helped install the proximity security layers. I knew which floors needed special swipe access. I knew which server racks would auto-lock if any user ID wasn't renewed by Friday noon. It was strange holding all of that in my head. 22 years of mental blueprints. And for the first time, I realized none of it belonged to them. They might have owned the business, but I owned the bones. I left Evelyn's office with my steps calm and slow. On the way back, I stopped outside the main conference room. Through the frosted glass, I could see Colin sitting at the end of the table, his jaw clenched, lips tight. Haley was next to him, nodding at something on a printout, probably trying to spin a new interpretation of the lease language, probably trying to paint me as a disgruntled ex-employee with a vendetta. They looked small in that room, temporary. And on the chair next to Colin sat something that made me pause. The silver Mont Blanc pen, the one they'd given me at the company's 15-year anniversary dinner. I'd left it behind when they cleared out my desk. I guess he thought it made him look decisive, but it just made him look like a man signing his own deadline. That night, I sat on the back patio with Dan, watching the late summer sky shift from gold to violet. "You really going to make him leave by Friday?" he asked. I didn't answer at first, just tapped the rim of my glass and watched the condensation slide. "They gave me 30 minutes to clear my desk, Dan," I said finally. No warning, no handshake, just a white envelope and an escort out. He nodded. "You think they deserve better?" Dan didn't answer either. Sometimes silence is the only honest reply. By Thursday night, I got a new message this time from Colin directly. "Walter, I understand emotions have been high lately. I'd appreciate a quick conversation before tomorrow's timeline is enforced. There's likely a mutually agreeable solution here. The Colin." I stared at it for a long time. Funny, no mention of the word apology, no mention of 22 years, just timeline, solution. I drafted a response, deleted it, then wrote just one sentence. Colin, the solution was offered in 2007. It's 2025 now. Then I closed my laptop. Before I slept that night, I picked up the Mont Blanc pen from my drawer, the real one, the original, the one they gave me with my initials engraved beneath the cap. I'd always thought I'd pass it on to someone at the company. Maybe Dan's kid if he joined someday, but now it would stay in my drawer. They still had 14 hours. I wasn't giving them 15. I know that kind of silence, the kind that comes when your power finally speaks but no one wants to admit it. If you've lived through something like that, hit like and subscribe. And tell me how long did they ignore your value before it hit them? Tomorrow the locks would change, and the smile on Colin's face would finally vanish. The meeting invite came with no subject line, just a time 10 a.m. and a Zoom link from Haley Trevors. I almost didn't click it, but curiosity can be its own kind of justice. When the screen lit up, it was Haley and Colin Reeves side by side in the executive conference room. Haley looked tight-lipped. Colin, he looked like he hadn't slept. Walter Colin began folding his hands with exaggerated calm. "We're hoping you can help us clarify a few things." I tilted my head. "Sure, though I imagine clarity's a two-way street." Haley cleared her throat. "There seems to be a misunderstanding with the property manager. She informed us that Eastmark Dynamics needs to vacate its current premises by end of day next Friday." I heard I said, keeping my voice even. "Seems the owner reviewed the lease agreement, the updated one, the one filed under Eastmark Holdings, not Dynamics." Colin blinked. Haley frowned. "That clause? We were told it had been voided." "It would have been," I said, "if someone had submitted the termination addendum by last June, but no one did. So the 5-year automatic renewal kicked in." They sat in stunned silence. I gave it one beat, then two. I kept a clean paper trail, I added. digital and physical. Every version time-stamped, notarized, filed with Mrs. Monroe's office. That name, Mrs. Evelyn Monroe, landed like a dropped wrench. Colin shifted in his seat. Walter, that location is the backbone of our supply chain. Do you understand the disruption you're triggering? I nodded slowly. I do. I also understand what it feels like to be erased by a company you helped build. Let's be reasonable, Haley said, her voice softening. We don't want to escalate. I held her gaze. Neither did I. When I was called into that room with a manila envelope, after 22 years, no explanation, no thanks, no exit strategy. Just a form letter. She looked down. Colin leaned forward. There's still time to resolve this. We'd be willing to revisit your severance package. I almost laughed. It's not about money, Colin. That stopped him cold. Then I added, you called me replaceable. But you forgot that systems remember, and leases record loyalty in ink. Silence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Haley spoke again carefully now. Walter, what do you want? I paused. What I wanted couldn't be boxed into a settlement figure or a rehire email. What I wanted was for them to feel what I had felt, that cold realization that the people you served for decades would cut you loose the moment it was politically convenient. I want you to understand the cost of forgetting who built your foundation, I said quietly. And I want you out. Haley's face hardened. Colin leaned back, rubbing his temples. Good luck finding another facility with that zoning and infrastructure before next quarter's audit, I added. The call ended without goodbyes. I sat back in my chair, staring at the dimmed laptop screen. My fingers were steady, but my stomach wasn't. For a second, I wondered, had I gone too far? Then I remembered the day they walked me out without letting me say goodbye to Dan Mercer. The look on Dan's face through the glass as the badge scanner clicked red. Some things you don't unfeel. There's a point where silence stops being passive. It becomes strategy. By the next morning, the first freight order was already canceled. The commercial cleaning contract was paused. And Bloom Pulse Inc., the biotech startup that had signed a conditional lease pending Eastmark's exit, sent over a courtesy update. They were accelerating their move-in timeline. Funny how things click into place when you stop trying to be agreeable. And just so we're clear, I wasn't done yet. Because the last clause in that lease, it had nothing to do with rent. It had everything to do with access. I had kept one key, just one, the one that wasn't supposed to exist. And they were about to find out why that mattered. By the end of that week, the parking lot was half empty. I'd stopped driving by out of habit. But Dan Mercer texted me a photo, 3 moving trucks lined up under a gray sky. Bloom Pulse's logo, barely visible through the mist as boxes and server racks got hauled out, like someone being evicted from a hotel. No ceremony, no warning, just gone. Turns out the board didn't like finding out their flagship HQ lease wasn't actually theirs. The lease had never been in Eastmark's name. For nearly 5 years, they had operated on a rolling sublease held by a commercial holding LLC I quietly acquired when the original property owner downsized. I paid cash. I'd kept my name off everything: silent partner, silent signature, silent consequence. So, when I declined to renew the sublease, that was it. No HR meeting, no executive roundtable, no clawback clause. Just Evelyn Monroe, property manager, executing the default terms to the letter. She stamped the 30-day notice, CC'd the board, and by Monday morning, she was showing the space to new tenants. Dan said the tour was almost surreal. A clean-cut solar tech firm full of bright-eyed engineers walking through the same halls I'd memorized for 2 decades. Evelyn pointed out the fiber vaults, the cold aisle containment retrofit I'd fought for in 2014, and the backup HVAC I'd designed after the 2011 outage. The same systems they said were outdated had become the building's main selling points. Colin Reeves wasn't there. Dan said he'd been working remote since the notice dropped. Legal review, supposedly. HR didn't handle it much better. Haley Trevors, the one who'd called my exit a difficult but necessary transition, resigned without a word. No final email, no thank you post. Just disappeared. Dan texted cultures collapsing. People are spooked. Chloe cried when they removed the nameplate. Chloe Penner, front desk. Always greeted me by name even on bad days, even after I was let go. I didn't expect to feel anything, but I did. It wasn't joy, not gloating, just quiet, like something heavy had been lifted but left a shadow behind. That morning, I stood in the kitchen holding a mug of coffee Laura had left for me. I stared at the steam like it might form an answer, Had I gone too far? Some people in that office didn't deserve the fallout. Dan, Chloe, even a few of the new kids who actually cared. But then I remembered that final HR meeting, the way Haley slid the envelope across the table like it was a napkin. No explanation. Just a scripted sentence and a cold room. I didn't fire anyone. I just let gravity do its work. For 22 years, I held the weight of that place up. My systems, my checklists, my manual override logs. Those same logs Evelyn submitted to the court when Eastmark's lawyers tried to stall the eviction. Colin once laughed at me for keeping paper maintenance records. I told him paper remembers what people try to forget. Now it remembered them. And the court did too. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. No headlines, no lawsuits yet, but the silence said enough. The building had outlasted its tenants. My systems had survived their masters. Still, I wasn't finished. This wasn't just about a building or a lease. There was one last thread left to pull, one signature they'd overlooked. The final clause that wasn't just about real estate. It was about legacy, and I was ready to sign it, because Colin still didn't understand what I'd built beneath him. But he was about to find out. I didn't even have to open the article. The headline alone said everything. Eastmark Dynamics faces eviction and operational crisis amidst property dispute. I leaned back in my chair, coffee in hand, watching the digital ripples spread. One publication picked it up, then another. Then the Freight Logistics Board started speculating. They always do. Something about watching a long-standing regional player trip over its own shoelaces gets people talking. I wasn't the source, of course. I didn't need to be. That Monday morning, Colin Reeves called a company-wide meeting. Haley Trevors was the only other executive in the room, shifting in her seat like she'd rather be anywhere else. Several staff members told me later that he looked like he hadn't slept. Someone caught a screenshot of the Zoom call, shirt collar uneven voice trembling slightly as he read from a prepared statement. We are in discussions with the property manager regarding a misunderstanding over the lease. Except it wasn't a misunderstanding. The formal notice had been served 3 days prior. Mrs. Evelyn Monroe doesn't serve misunderstandings. She serves timelines. I heard from Dan Mercer he messaged me quietly that morning. Just one sentence. Haley's been in the file room since 7 a.m. I think she knows. I knew what she'd be looking for. The addendum Colin had initialed in 2011 giving me a first right of refusal on any operational transition agreement, an obscure clause buried inside an outdated operations continuity policy. Written by me, reviewed by legal, signed in haste when the building was expanding, forgotten by everyone, except me. She found it, and that was the first domino. By Tuesday afternoon, trucks were being rerouted. Their lead logistics vendor, Brannock Transfer, suspended service pending legal clarification of occupancy. Internally, panic was setting in. I didn't gloat, but I did notice that the thermostat for the East Wing, still remotely controlled by my old legacy dashboard, was now reading 86 degrees. I'd always told them the system should have been updated. There was something quiet about watching it fall. No flames, no crash, just a long, slow unraveling, like thread pulling from a suit you once wore proudly. A thread no one thought to check until the seams were already open. They called me dead weight, and now every brick of their stability had my name under it. It wasn't about getting back at them. Not really, not even about vindication. It was about being remembered as the man who kept it standing when no one noticed. That old brass key they took from me, I still had the original imprint. I kept it in a drawer wrapped in the same cloth I used the day they handed it to me in 2003. Dan had been there, so had Colin, back when things still felt like a team. How far back do you have to go before things stop feeling like betrayal? By Wednesday, Bloom Pulse Inc., the company set to replace Eastmark, publicly confirmed their move-in was delayed indefinitely. They weren't going to inherit chaos. And Mrs. Monroe. She sent a brief update to Eastmark's board, CCing Colin. Based on Section 4C of the current lease, amended in 2011, we are now in compliance with tenant transition. Please remove assets from the premises by the 18th. The 18th was 5 business days away. No press conference, no apology. Just one cut-through line of policy. And that's all it ever took. Colin hasn't called, Haley hasn't emailed, but someone updated their LinkedIn headers from Eastmark Dynamics to Seeking New Opportunity. Quiet little signals. I took one more sip of coffee and closed my laptop. They thought it was about payback. It wasn't. It was about making sure the next person in that building knows who really kept the lights on. And in 24 hours, I'll be the one turning them off. It started with a message from someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year. Subject line, "Let's talk urgent. Sender Evelyn Monroe." At first I thought it might be a mistake, but when I opened it, the first line made me sit up. "Walter, I've reviewed the situation at Eastmark. I need to speak to you directly, not as a property manager, as someone looking for help." I stared at the screen, my coffee going cold beside me. This wasn't a lease dispute. This was something else. When we spoke the next morning, her tone was different. Less professional, more cautious. She told me Bloom Pulse Inc. was preparing to file a notice of default against Eastmark. The build-out they had promised hadn't happened. Rent hadn't cleared in 3 weeks. Contractors were backing out. And then came the line that told me exactly how bad things had gotten. Their CEO asked if you were still involved. I said no, but I think that's about to change. I didn't smile, not yet. I just listened. Because Evelyn wasn't just looping me in, she was inviting me back in. That same week, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. "Mr. Harlan, this is Lydia Tran, EVP of Operations for Bloom Pulse. We're looking to bring on a compliance infrastructure lead, short-term high impact. Your name came up in 3 separate conversations." I let her talk, listened as she laid out the scope. Rebuild the legacy lease frameworks, audit the vendor compliance trail train, their internal facilities staff to handle lease transitions more aggressively. It was everything I used to do for Eastmark, only now I'd be doing it on the other side, with teeth. She ended with a line I'll never forget. "We need someone who knows how Eastmark works, preferably someone who helped build it." And that was the shift. For 22 years, I'd been the man who held the key. Now I was being asked to write the next policy that decides who gets one. I asked her for the timeline. She said, "As soon as you're ready. We've already budgeted your rate." I closed my laptop and just sat there. A year ago, I was holding a brass key in a quiet hallway, trying to make peace with the fact that everything I'd built could be taken in one meeting. Now I was being offered control of the corridor, not just a room in it. Dan Mercer called later that night. He'd heard the rumor. "You're going back in." "No," I said. "I'm building forward." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "You still got that key?" I reached into the old drawer where I'd tossed it. The brass had dulled, but I hadn't thrown it away. That key didn't belong to a company anymore. It belonged to the man who remembered everything. And I hadn't forgotten a thing. But it wasn't the offer that sealed it. It was who tried to stop it next and why. I walked through the Eastmark lobby again, only this time, no badge. No awkward small talk with Haley Trevors. No check-in with facilities. Just a quiet nod from the new front desk assistant who handed me a visitor sticker that felt like a name tag at a funeral. "Walter Harlan, vendor escort Dan Mercer." Dan met me by the elevators. Same blue polo, same key ring on his belt. But his eyes held something new: fatigue. "They told me you'd be coming in for the data handoff," he said. "But they didn't tell me you'd be the one who knew where the backups actually were." I smiled, but it didn't reach all the way. Funny how memory becomes valuable after you fire everyone who has it. We walked in silence past the server room, the one I used to open with a key I still kept in a drawer at home, next to the old HVAC master override manual. The nameplate beside the door now read, "Systems Archive." But no one was inside. They'd tried to modernize too fast. Bloom Pulse needed legacy access for their own migration, and Eastmark had no idea how to give it to them. That's why I was here. Contracted through Bloom Pulse as an external consultant. They had to buy back what they discarded. In the hallway outside my old office, I saw a stack of unopened delivery boxes marked urgent. Below them, a faded poster still hung crooked on the corkboard, "Processes memory." I'd made that poster 10 years ago as a joke. Now it looked like a prophecy. Dan leaned in. "You heard about Colin Reeves." I nodded. The board had issued a no-confidence vote the previous week. Word was he was negotiating his own exit package quietly, of course. No press, just shame. "And Haley?" I asked. "Gone, not even a notice. Just one Monday, her name was off the directory." We reached the conference room. Mrs. Evelyn Monroe from Property Management was already inside going over facility transfer documents with the Bloom Pulse legal team. I handed over the system audit summary, the hardwired access codes, and the override key for the elevator server cabinet. Dan looked at it like it was a relic. "You kept that?" I met his gaze. I never forget what can break a building. No one said it out loud, but the room felt different now. I wasn't here for revenge anymore. I was here because someone needed to remember how the place actually ran, how the air system calibrated to avoid power surges, how the fire panel talked to the compliance server, how a patch panel in the janitor's closet controlled the East Wing's redundancy failover. Legacy doesn't live in dashboards. It lives in decisions no one remembers until the lights go out. As I turned to leave, Dan caught up and said quietly, "You were right, about the trigger loop in the emergency script. It hit us during that first blackout." I paused, letting the weight of that sentence settle. "I didn't want to be right," I said. "I wanted to be kept." Back in the parking lot, I sat in my truck for a long minute before starting the engine. Through the windshield, I could see the Eastmark sign half covered by a Bloom Pulse banner, the letters curling at the edges where the adhesive had peeled. It looked temporary, like someone trying to pretend the past hadn't left fingerprints on the walls. I didn't need a nameplate or a title anymore. I had something better. I had the map. And the question now was, who else forgot who drew it? Dan left a thermos on my new desk the morning after Bloom Pulse moved in. Same battered Stanley I'd seen him fill every day for 15 years. Just black coffee. No sugar, no fuss. Inside the lid was a folded note. "You didn't just fix the building, you fixed the balance." I sat for a long while, not drinking anything. Just watching the early trucks roll past, feeling the sun hit the window the way it never used to in the old sublevel room. People still think this was about revenge, about teaching Colin Reeves and Haley Trevors some corporate lesson. But that's not it. Not really. This was about not disappearing. For 22 years, I documented every wiring shift, every server migration, every HVAC override and compliance handoff. I kept their core functioning through buyouts, lawsuits, hurricanes, and 3 failed expansions. And when they thought no one would care, I made sure someone did. My name is still listed on the metadata tags for half the compliance override logs in the building. They didn't wipe that. They couldn't. And the new tenants Bloom Pulse didn't just move into the space. They inherited the system. And when their CTO asked me to stay on as a consultant, I didn't hesitate. Not for a second. Not for a paycheck either. For continuity. Mrs. Monroe dropped off a new key card last week. Different logo. Same chip architecture I helped pilot in 2009. She smiled when she handed it to me and said, "They told me you built this place from inside out." I smiled back, but I didn't correct her. Because I didn't build it alone, I built it with Dan, with the night crews, with a clipboard and a label printer, and a mind that refused to let disorder slide just because no one was watching. I still walk by the old HR office sometimes, lights off, door locked. A faint outline of a removed nameplate where Haley's name used to be. No one talks about the security investigation that followed, or the asset misreporting tied to Colin's bonuses. I don't need them to. The silence is enough. A week ago, a junior tech from Bloom asked if I wanted my name officially added to the new system schematic, said it would help with version control. I told him no. Legacy shouldn't be about credit. It should be about what survives. And the truth, I never wanted applause. I just didn't want the work, the real work, to vanish when someone decided I looked too old on a budget spreadsheet. They took my badge. I kept the building. And now, every time I walk past that same breaker panel, they tried to hide behind drywall. I remember the way Haley looked at me when she said, "You're just facilities." No, I was the foundation. If you've ever been erased by someone who thought your silence meant surrender, you know how this feels. Share your own experiences. Like and subscribe for more stories.